I'm going to go ahead and get started on session 1 called The Basic Reliability of the Bible. So if you think about the Bible that you have in front of you, you probably all have a copy of some kind of an English translation of the Bible. We tend to think about the Bible in modern terms in unhelpful ways in Christianity. And so at least this first session, I want to do two things. I want you to think about the Bible in appropriate terms. What is it as a historical document? And then we're going to talk about why it's important for us to think accurately about what the Scriptures are and how they come down to us. So the first piece is, even though your book is bound together, maybe in a fancy leather cover and some other kind of cover, these books, it's not like it's a book in the way that The Hobbit is a book, or a book in the way that, J.R. Tolkien, J.K. Rowling wrote, the 7 Harry Potter books. It's not something written by one author in one period of time, even in one language. It crosses cultures, many different authors, huge spans of time, and it goes through multiple what are called redactions or edits along the way. So what Moses might write, let's say in the first, when he first sits down and records things and writes them down, those things get edited and redacted over time, so that by the time the Israelites are coming out of the exile, there are some additions or notes being made by later scribes, and those things find their way into the text of the Bible. And it's important for us to think about it, the whole historical process, because otherwise, if you go to someone who's not a Christian, or who has skepticism about Christianity, or if you yourself have this kind of, let's say, strange notion about what the Bible is, well, that's not really helpful because it's not really true about what the Bible is. So the Bible isn't a book that was written by the finger of God, then it comes floating down to the church right when she's established after Acts chapter 2, and then it rules for the rest of time. The Bible it's a little bit messier than that of a process, and I think as Christians, we kind of have to face the music on that, because it's not actually that scary if you understand what's going on. But we have to think about it in those terms. So first I want to talk in this session just about the Bible as a historical document, not really yet as a religious document, just as a historical document. And then I want to talk about some of the pieces or elements in the text itself that I think lend to its credibility. So the first thing is that when the Bible speaks about things in history, it speaks about things in what we would call historically reliable ways. So Luke, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, both written by the author Luke, they discuss the history of Christianity, basically from the time of Christ up until you find Paul in prison in Rome. That's kind of the time span that it covers. And during that whole course of time, Luke makes several observations or references to things that are going on in the first century world. For instance, he notes that Pilate is the local governor who's the one responsible for crucifying Jesus. He notes the Sanhedrin, who's responsible for putting Jesus on trial in the first place. He notes that you have Tiberius, who reigns in the land in the early chapters. He notes various Herods who rule over the Judean people at that time. And all of those historical details are present in the Gospel of Luke, and they're the kind of things that historians, when they go to say, what was the ancient world like, Luke serves as what's called a primary source text for them. So even people who don't think of Luke as an inspired text, or Luke as a religious text, have to reconcile with Luke as a historical text, because it's a eyewitness or near eyewitness to events that happen in the first century world. So the Bible is historically reliable in that kind of way. Similarly, when you have the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, probably a two-part book that's really meant to be read as one continuous document, it describes the Jews returning from the exile, how that happens, the messiness of that whole process, the rebuilding of the wall, and even some of the sin that they struggle with along the way. And all of those things can be verified in other documents. Like you can go to Assyrian and Babylonian documents and you can read about how the Jewish people were eventually sent back into their own land. And there's actually historical explainers for that. For example, when they're first brought into exile, the Assyrians conquered people by taking them, removing them from their territory, and basically keeping them as exiles in foreign lands. That was the Assyrian strategy. The Persian strategy was a little bit different. When the Persians come into power, and Cyrus is a ruler over the Persians, when the Persians come into power, one of the things they do is they think that it's very difficult to keep a people enslaved in a foreign country, it's actually easier to manage people by putting them back in their native territory and just having them give you money from the fruit of their land. So they invent or they produce a system where they basically let the people go back, worship their own gods, cultivate their own land, rule over their own cities and territories, and all they have to do is give money to this Persian Empire and not rebel against the Persian Empire. And when you look at the timeline of the exiles of the northern and then the southern kingdom under Assyria and Babylon, and then when the Persian Empire comes into power over and against the Babylonians, that exact thing happens in the record. The Persians don't just do that for the Jews, they also do that for many other peoples whom they conquered. They go and they send them back into their territory, they give them funds to rebuild cities and walls that were previously destroyed, and they institute local rulers and kings. They allow worship to whatever the local deity is. And so that historical narrative actually matches the history data that we have. And it's partly because that historical data comes from the scriptures as well as other texts of that time. So the Bible is, at least in what it's talking about historically, it is what we would call a basically reliable text. Meaning, when it talks about things that we can otherwise verify, it is proven correct. And that's an important note because often some people will look at certain parts of the Bible and say, well, we can't prove that. And they will assume that a lack of evidence is the same thing as contrary evidence. And those two are not the same thing. A lack of evidence is not the same thing as evidence against a certain thing. But where the Bible has been given archaeological evidence to support it, all that evidence comes out to basically follow the biblical narrative and basically match the data that we have from the Bible. Now, there are some things that are not yet proven in the historical record. Like, how do you prove a Red Sea crossing taking place? And there are some strange ways that people have tried to do that. But the point is, there are some things that we shouldn't really expect to find in an archaeological dig or in some kind of historical record. For instance, there's no record of an exodus happening from Egypt. The Egyptians never record that. And so some people have taken that to note that, well, this is proof that the Hebrews invented their own backstory. There was no exodus. There was no Yahweh versus Ra or whatever else going on there. And so this is proof that the Hebrews at least fictionalized that part of their narrative. Well, the problem with that, of course, is the Egyptians are famous for not recording any of their losses. The Egyptian kings and the Egyptian rulers never talk about when they get beaten in battle. They expunge that all from the record. And by the way, that's pretty common. Chinese emperors did the same thing in their own historical archives. In fact, there's one Chinese emperor who's famous for, he had a historian following him to document his legacy. He falls off of a horse and he tells the historian, you can't write about that. And the historian records it, it's put in prison for it, and years later, his record survives, and the only thing that this emperor is actually known for is the fact that he fell off the horse and he was upset and he wanted that out of the record. So the point, of course, of all that is the Egyptians were like that. They wanted to purify the record of their losses. So if they lost a bunch of slaves overnight, and there was a humiliating defeat that crippled the Egyptian economy, why would they record that? They don't record any other losses like that over their history. We know the Egyptians lost in other places when they don't record it because other peoples record battles that they win over and against the Egyptians. So the Bible, in all of the ways we can see into the record matches what we see in the biblical data. And there's plenty of places still where there's not evidence either for or against. And that doesn't mean that that's a problem because evidence neither for nor against from an archaeological site or elsewhere doesn't prove anything or disprove anything. It just means it's a neutral point in the data. So the historical reliability of the Bible, and in this case I want to shift particularly to the New Testament, has one more thing going for it, which is that if there's anything else that we can know about the first century world, it's that there was a person named Jesus of Nazareth who at least was crucified for claiming to be a Messiah, and that shortly after his crucifixion, his followers started a movement that became a huge problem for the Jewish people, a huge problem for the first century Roman world, and ultimately a movement that triumphs over and against Roman paganism. It triumphs over local Judaism. Judaism is scattered. Christianity remains central to that part of the world. And if you know anything else about the historical data, that fact is agreed on. In fact, these are just some class notes that I have from seminary, and I'll just read you some of the samples that you have that testify to this. So the Talmud is a Jewish document that's essentially a running commentary on history of and data from the Jewish Bible, or the Hebrew Old Testament. And in one section of the Talmud, when they're talking about various things that happened in and around the first century world, they describe this. They say, There was a man, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu of Nazareth was hanged. And for 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel towards apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor should come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hung on the eve of the Passover. By the way, hung is a synonym for crucifixion. Hung on the eve of the Passover. And one of the local rabbis retorted, "Do you suppose that he was the one for whom a defense could be made? Was he not a Mashiach, or someone who was an enticer? So someone who is not a Messiah, but a false Messiah." And so one of the rabbis comments, the reason no defense was made for Jesus and the reason he was crucified was because he was a false Messiah. So the Talmud is a document that has no reason to affirm Jesus of Nazareth, but because it's so historically verifiable, they talk about Jesus of Nazareth and they say, yeah, he was crucified and he was a false Messiah. So there's some notions in the modern world that, Jesus never existed, he was made up, all this stuff is imagined, and that's just not true. Whatever else is true about Jesus, he was there in the first century world and he was crucified. I would say that's over and against what the Quran says about Jesus. The Quran says that Jesus came, that he was a prophet, and he was never crucified, which is just against every other piece of historical data that we have. People disagree on whether he was a true Messiah, whether he resurrected, but really no one who's looking at the data disagrees that he lived and that he was crucified for his claims to be a Messiah. Josephus, who's a Jewish writer and historian, says in his Antiquities, "Now there was about this time Jesus, who was a wise man, and if it be lawful to even call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure." By the way, Josephus is not a Christian. He's a Jewish writer serving the Roman Empire who's talking about the downfall of the Jewish people when they're being destroyed in Jerusalem. And he writes, "He drew over to himself both many of the Jews as well as many of the Gentiles. He was the Messiah." And he's not saying that because he believes it. He's saying that's what he was claimed to be. "And when Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day. And because the divine prophets had foretold of these 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and then the sect of Christians so named from him are not even extinct to this day." So Josephus, writing about the history of Jesus, says all these things. He himself is not a Christian. He's a Jewish man. And then there's another man, this one is a Roman historian, Tacitus, writes in his Annals that consequently, to get rid of the report, a false report or a bad report about Nero, which was true about Nero, but a bad report about him, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class which was hated for all of their abominations, called the Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of that evil, but also in the whole Roman Empire, where all things hideous and shameful from every year of the world find their center and become popular. And accordingly, an arrest was first made for all who plead guilty, and then upon information, immense multitude was convicted. So Nero has bad press going on, and what he does to resolve this bad press is he says, I'm not guilty of this thing, the Christians are guilty of this thing. And that's fine because all the pagans hate the Christians, the Jews hate the Christians, everyone is set up against the Christians. They have no power, they have no sway in this empire. And so Nero blames them and then persecutes them. The Neronian persecution is one of the first brutal persecutions against the Christians. In fact, a famous story about that is that he uses Christians as martyrs to light up his garden at night. So he hangs them on crosses and burns them to light up his dinner parties. So. And he justifies doing that because he says they're responsible for the pillaging and the downfall of our empire. And of course, actually it was Nero who was responsible for those things. So anyway, all that to say, the Bible, in even these quotes that I've read so far, you can recognize the same contours of what the New Testament talks about with Jesus of Nazareth and the claims about him. So the Bible, if anything else, is historically reliable. And actually, I think that's something that is helpful for us to understand. What then binds together the Gospels, the book of Acts, the rest of the New Testament, is this central obsession with the resurrection. So the resurrection is kind of what binds together and verifies all of these documents. So if there's a writer in the apostolic era who's talking about the resurrection and the implication for Christians, those books are what make it into basically the New Testament canon. The resurrection is that kind of binding glue that seals together all these diverse writers and authors and letters. The last two pieces, I'm going to go through these rather quickly, are just two data points that I think are often used against Christians when we're talking about Scripture. But I think if you just look at the Bible as a historical document, there's two pieces of data that are actually really helpful for seeing the Bible as a reliable piece of historical data. The first one is what's called verisimilitude. Now that's in your notes, so you don't need to figure out how to spell that. Verisimilitude is a word that I was introduced to like 2 years ago, and it basically just means that a book or an author is writing something that seems realistic. It's not dolled up. It's not beautified. For example, Superman has no verisimilitude, right? You shoot him with a bullet, he doesn't die. He gets smashed by a train, no problem. He just brushes it off. There's no verisimilitude to real life like that. Even a famous example of this is The Spy, James Bond. His stories are entertaining, but there's no verisimilitude, right? He sleeps with whatever woman he wants to. And actually, it's funny, you can see this in the James Bond movies, is that he'll be in like the worst fight scenes of all time, and he'll pop up from that, and his suit is like cleanly pressed, and there's no dirt on it. It's like, there's no verisimilitude in that. It's entertaining, but no one is convinced or thinking that he's trying to write a realistic spy. That's just not the intent of the author. Well, the Bible is a book that has verisimilitude. Let me just give you some examples of this. King David, king of Israel, the man whom is the later pattern for what other kings should be like, the Bible records him sinning multiple times. So the Bible doesn't doll up King David. It says, here's a man who is fallen like every other man, King David. The book of Judges, the people of Israel land in the promised land at the end of the book of Joshua. They conquer the whole land of Canaan. If you're writing a book that's an invented history, what are you going to do next? And we dominated, we followed God, we worship purely. What does the book of Judges tell us? None of that happened. In fact, we went in the exact opposite direction that the Israelites were told to go. The book of Judges is verisimilitude. It tells about people, how they actually are. It doesn't invent things. Paul's conversion in the New Testament is an element of verisimilitude. Here you have a man who's later going to be the person who brings the gospel to the Gentiles, and he's supposed to be one of these primary apostolic witnesses in the New Testament. And when you're introduced to him in the New Testament, he's participating in the stoning of Stephen, and then later persecuting Christians before he's converted. Oh, why would you invent an apostle like that who has no primary contact with Jesus? You have to deal with that later in the Bible. Well, it has verisimilitude. It smacks of something that's real and not something that was invented. The last two pieces are similar. Peter denies Jesus. He's the chief of the apostles. Same kind of thing. Why would you record that unless it actually happened that way? And then this piece, women are the only eyewitnesses to the resurrected tomb at first. Now, Jesus comes later and witnesses to the rest of the apostles. But if you're starting a movement in the first century world, and it's a Jewish sect movement, women are not good eyewitnesses accounts. In fact, their eyewitness testimony is considered frivolous and non-reliable. Male testimony is considered reliable. So you're a man in the first century, and you're starting Christianity from scratch. And you're thinking, how can I gain the approval of other Jews or other first century Romans? How can I gain their approval? Well, you certainly wouldn't include women as your primary source text for this movement. But all of the Gospels exclusively mention the rest of the apostles fled, and the women stayed and actually came to the tomb the next morning. They are the primary witnesses. Now, there's just no reason to do that unless that's actually what happened. So, and then this last piece of data is where I'll close. The Bible is independently preserved. This is over and against the Quran. The Quran has very few textual variants, and we'll talk about textual criticism in a later session. The Quran has very few textual variants, and that's totally understandable. It's because after Muhammad died and after his immediate eyewitnesses pass away, a man called Uthman rises to the power position in the Muslim empire, and he sends people into all the land, has them collect all the various Qurans and recitations that are out there, and he standardizes and burns all of the contrasting recitations. So Uthman destroys all of the contrary evidence against the one recitation that he preserves. And so, yeah, if you have a Quran today and any of the other Qurans that follow from Uthman, there's very little variation, but that's because he destroyed all of the variation. And there's no way for them to prove otherwise because they were all destroyed. In the New Testament, we have a bunch of data and variation because it's all independently preserved. At no point in time, even when Christians became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, do they go destroying other papyri or go destroying other books. Those other books are kept, preserved, and all of the various transmission streams actually help with the reliability of the text. Because if you have all of this variation and all of these different variants going on, it actually helps you to see what is the message of this book. I'll talk about this later in textual criticism more, but the point I just want you to see here is when you have a bunch of errors or a bunch of variants in a book, it actually helps you to see better what is true and what is original to that book in a way that you couldn't do if you just had one standardized copy going back to, let's say, the 10th century. There's just no way to know what's behind it, but in the New Testament, we have papyri going down into the early 2nd century that actually match, or when they disagree, it's minor disagreement with later manuscripts that come thousands of years afterwards. So let me pause there. I just want you to focus just then on the Bible as a historical text, nothing more for this first session. Do you guys have any questions so far? You don't have to, but I just want to make sure I strike the iron while it's hot. All right. If no questions, stretch your legs for a few minutes, and then we'll return here 3 minutes from now for the second session.